Man, alright, there is a lot to talk about with this chapter, aside from the actual fight and how it ended, because this is something I think everyone was anticipating, and I'm talking about Raiden's backstory. We get a full rundown of his sumo upbringing and how that relates to the end of chapter 38. So similar to Shiva, Raiden's story is about starting from the bare bottom and how he climbed to the top, and I think this alone is huge in a way that completely separates this fight from any of the fights we've seen before, because it basically grants both Shiva and Raiden, both the god and the human, a sense of humility. Like, they both come from humble beginnings, unlike say Poseidon, who was personally inclined to being perfect, or Thor, who was born into godhood by being Odin's son. I mean, we've seen extremely humble characters before, like Kojiro and Heracles, but I think this chapter makes it like full front and center by going into like the meaningful parts of Raiden's childhood up until he reached his peak of success and notoriety. There's plenty of irony and parallels between Shiva and Raiden that can be made now after this chapter. For example, like at the beginning, when Raiden asks his mom why he's such a freak, basically, and she tells him he's actually just absolutely special and loved by God. He ultimately declares his motivation to being there for the week, right? Going so far as to save his village, and then studying sumo to gather enough money to provide for his hometown. But yeah, even then he was abnormally strong and special. Even though he was all that, he wasn't skilled enough to beat Tanikaze when they first challenge each other, and we see then that he ends up actually being trained by Tanikaze himself. So despite how naturally strong he was, he still had to discipline himself enough to learn and then climb the ranks until he could earn his fame and success. Now on Shiva's end, he never even had a genuine reason to climbing the top of India, because he only does it for the fun of being with his best friend. Out of all the Hindu gods he fights, we don't even see him struggle to get to the peak, which is really interesting, again, considering how this parallels to Raiden's upbringing. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure Shiva put blood and sweat and tears into what he did to eventually become the one true leader of the Hindu gods. We see proof of that, so it shows. But it has nothing to do with discipline or self-sacrifice or plagues or natural disasters, basically anything that actually gave reason for growth. This is exactly why Shiva's pretty much the same guy he's always been. We even notice the Hindu gods mention this when we see them watching from the audience, and even in the fight itself, Shiva gives into the fun of the fight. The only time he decides to get serious is when he suddenly remembers Rudra or hears the crowd chanting for him, because he himself, he's not compelled to actually winning the fight. It's more like the fun is honestly the only thing that matters here. It's weird because despite how different their backgrounds are, they ultimately know what it's like to, again, put your blood and sweat and tears into what got them at their peak. And this chapter confirms that they both have that in common, regardless of how different the reasons may be. This is something I've been noticing since really early on in the fight, and exactly why I believe most people in the fandom love Shiva, because he's a very human character. He's just a bro, and you can't kind of help but like him. However, this is exactly why I think Shiva is gonna lose. Honestly, I don't think it's in Shiva's favor from a story perspective to be so human when he's supposed to be so godly, which is ironic for Raiden, because he was basically a walking Superman for everyone in Japan during his time. I mean, we even see he didn't even look like your average sumo, so he was just quite literally built different. Also, unlike Shiva, who deserved the peak of India but accepted it despite knowing he didn't want it, or pretty much carried that responsibility regardless of whether or not he wanted to, Raiden was honest with himself. We see this when he gets confronted by Tanikaze for throwing a match that he could have won, and Raiden just tells him straight up he couldn't handle beating his opponent if it meant crushing him. And this is literally honestly my favorite part in the chapter. I love it so much because this is exactly why Raiden is that much bigger of a person than Shiva, because he had to endure so much self-sacrifice and discipline to reach his fame and success, only to throw it all away because he couldn't come to terms with what it meant for him to ultimately become the one and only title holder of the world's best sumo. And this is so interesting because Shiva has no idea what it means to be that honest with yourself, because if he did, Rudra would be leading the Hindu gods instead of him. But still, Raiden continued to fight as a sumo. We see this, and it almost looks like he lost that interest he originally had and the joy of fighting once he realized that he had to seal away his forbidden moves, because then it pretty much just becomes a means to an end to guarantee his hometown could still survive. So he pretty much just ended up losing a couple fights and draw twice because he didn't want to go full strength anymore on his opponents, implying he always just was the ultimate sumo, even beyond his era. I like that we see Raiden lose this interest also in fighting back then when he was still alive, because it just means that Shiva is now bringing that excitement back to him. And this is probably why chapter 38 was called Time of Awakening, because now, you know, Raiden can finally go all out and use his forbidden moves at full strength. It makes sense that, you know, it took so long to see this Raiden backstory, because all he was interested in was ending the fight without, you know, using everything at his disposal, because that was, you know, what he committed to doing when he was alive. And, you know, this in turn answers Raiden's question when he asks, I think somewhere early on in the fight, I forget when though, but it was when he asks why everyone seems to love watching people fight, and Shiva just looks at him confused, kind of like if he was crazy for asking that. But now we see that Raiden actually completely forgot what it was like to be that excited for a fight. We even see Shiva accuse Raiden of enjoying the fight at the end of this chapter, meaning that to Shiva it was just suddenly weird seeing Raiden you know, take an interest now. It's also really ironic that, you know, Raiden reminds Shiva Rudra when it was Rudra that said you should always use all of your strength in a fight to the death. I think that was like chapter 36 to 37. I forgot when it was exactly, but after all this backstory and just amazing writing, we finally see the moment of truth where Raiden finally goes full strength and just butchers two of Shiva's arms off. I'm also wondering if he busted Shiva's jaw on sleeve, because we see most of the impact on his face and kind of like the arms were just, you know, in the way of it. So I'm curious if most of the damage is to his face. But either way, this should be the deal breaker for anyone thinking Shiva was gonna win. Personally, I don't see any way Shiva can win this, and I'm trying my best to look at it from all angles. I honestly am, and I just don't see Raiden losing. It just wouldn't make sense after all the build-up he's been getting, to be honest. And I mean, I have a whole video on why Raiden should win, where I go more in depth into the reasoning, but this chapter just doesn't change my mind at all. I mean, if Raiden loses somehow, he's just getting robbed at that point, and it would need I guess some like out of left field writing for that to happen. But because I don't see any realistic way for Shiva to come back from this, it would just take massive creative effort for that to be the case. And, you know, in all fairness, that can definitely be the case. We all know how creative the writing can be, and I will not argue against that. But the facts right now are that, you know, the odds are just 100% against Shiva, and I'm so hyped to see how Shiva manages to hurt Raiden, because I think Raiden is, you know, he's going to have to take some damage next chapter. But the next chapter is apparently the last, so who knows, maybe this is the first overwhelming victory we see in Ragnarok. That would be interesting. I'll be really surprised if the writers decide to go that route. But that's all from me, guys. Let me know what you guys think. If you like the video, please leave a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you want to see more, please consider subscribing. That's all from me, guys, and have a great day.